Welcome back, everybody. I want to end this section on philosophy of complex systems by looking at nomadic science, which is a notion brought forward by Gilles Deleuze, and relating this to a particular disposition towards how we interact with the world, how we try to make things come to be. So the word nomadic science, we can look at this as traced to the word nomad or nomas, which translates to roaming in search of pasture. And when we think of roaming in search of pasture, what do we mean? We mean sort of a looking for places that are ripe, sites that are ripe for us to engage with them. So what does it mean to have ripe sites, and how can we relate this back to design? Okay, so for Deleuze and Felix Guattari, they position our way of interacting with the world as being based on two sort of mental perspectives or two sciences. And they contrast the idea of royal science with nomadic science. And the way they describe royal science is much like the way we tend to operate in the world today, particularly in Western cultures, which is what they call extensive thinking. And they relate this to ideas about laws, firm regulations, fixed notions of what things are, and the idea that you can represent things as things, a very kind of object-oriented approach to the world. They describe this as striated, so sort of broken up into pieces. And in contrast, they talk about a nomadic way of operating, which they describe as intensive thinking. And by intensities, what they mean is ideas around forces, flows, or processes. And so you can think how when we come back to this idea of design, when we think of extensive thinking, we're talking about the individual designs themselves. When we're talking about intensive thinking, we're talking about the kinds of background forces that might lead to a particular design emerging according to shifts in parameters. So this is much more about smooth gradations as how things shift from one state to another, depending on how they interact with forces. Another way to think about this, and another way that they describe the sciences, is that royal science is state science. It's governed from above with fixed rules, forms in a very hierarchical way, and that it's operating from the top down, command and control. In contrast, they talk about nomadic science, and they describe this as a kind of war machine that's much more tactical, that's responsive to individual particularities, to the situation at hand, and that operates from the bottom up. So in that way, it's sort of a bunch of individual actors who are sort of saying, this is a situation, here is how I respond to this situation. And the global response is a kind of emergent piece coming from that bottom up. Just want to make sure that you can see this whole slide. So I'm going to minimize myself a little bit, I think, if I can. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So let's take a look at comparing these two ways of thinking. So we have royal science. Oh, and you know what? The heading on the slide isn't exactly accurate, because really I want to be comparing these sort of two planes of immanence. So ignore this title. What I want to look at really is the plane of organization imposed from the royal science perspective, or the plane of immanence. What is emanating? What is immanent in the situation at hand, or inherent in the situation at hand? So one is trying to kind of impose a sort of order. The other is trying to kind of react. One is about stasis. The other is about becoming and fluidity. One is about rules. The other is about continuous variation. Coming back to an image of the hand that I showed you before, one is about striated space, or 5 fingers. The other is about smooth space, or 4 relations. The other relationship that they speak about is the difference between pouvoir and puissance. And these are two words coming from the French. One is really more about power over. The other is about capacities, or power to. So power over is how do we rule, how do we impose, how do we control. Capacity is how do we give rise to kind of potentialities, enabling things to happen. One is about the idea of kind of imperial essences, and the other they talk about as being about vagueness, or vagabondic wandering, undecidedness. So this vagueness ties in again to the fact that we can't sort of have a kind of essential control over things. It has much more to do with an exploration of the space of capacities. The other relationship that they make is the example of chess versus the example of Go. And two different games, one really controls by rules, the other controlled much more by kind of the capacities that are unfolding. So these are some of the lines they draw between royal science and nomadic science. If we think about this in relationship to design, and this time I do have the right caption, so all of these things, what are we talking about if we're talking about design? We can compare the idea of command, control, and predict versus the idea of respond, react, and unfold. So circles, right? The idea of a circle is a static idea. It's like a fixed essence. We can think of like the perfect circle and the Platonic ideas. But the idea of roundness is a different idea. It's not quite as specific as circle. It's more vague. It's more fluid. We can have ideas about roundness without it being so precise as the idea of a circle. The other piece is the notion of what a Renaissance architect, how they would be thinking about space. So in the case of a Renaissance architect, stone is obeying the metric plan. We draw out how to cut the stone, and the stone then has to submit to the command of the stonemason who carves it according to the preconceived ideals, the fixed idea of what something should be. Now here's where it gets very interesting. Think about it instead of how the Renaissance architect would work with the stonemason, how Gothic journeymen would respond to the stone. So this is a different way of engaging with stonework, where there would be sort of a general notion of where construction would need to go. And then the Gothic journeyman would sort of pick a stone and sort of look at the gap, consider the stone and say, okay, well, how can I draw out the right potential of the stone and place it in the wall just so that it sort of is responding to the stones that have gone before it? And I had a very interesting personal experience of this when I had some work done in my home on putting in a stone fireplace. And the crew that came to work on it, it was like watching magic at work. They had a pile of stones on the floor on a tarp, and they would have a gap in the wall, and they would look at the stones and they'd pick one up and they'd sort of study it, and then they'd take a pick to it and they'd chop up a little piece of it, and then they'd sort of look at it and they would slot it into place, and then they'd go and they'd do the next one based on what that next opening looks like. So a much more sort of responsive, engaged dialogue with the stone compared to the idea of precisely carving everything to pieces and then just sort of slotting them in. Oh, this one here goes here, this one here, this one here. I'm just following the plan, I'm following the rule, I'm following the order. It was a much more of a real engagement with the materiality. So when we talk about this idea of new materiality, we're also talking about this idea that the stone itself is bringing something to the table, and that part of the role of the designer or the constructor is to be responding to this materiality. So again, going back to this idea of command and control, we have the idea of forming, where matter awaits order or being governed, versus dispars, they describe it as, or diversifying, no constants but variables, how do we activate the variables? The ideas of laws or constants versus differential forces, where individuation appears through events, through forces that are at play at a given moment. And that here we would occupy space by counting or measuring. And in a nomadic way, we would occupy space by exploration, by legwork, which is why I'm out on a desert at the moment, as opposed to my normal background for the classes. Okay, so I realize this is all very, 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 very abstract. And so you are all wondering how any of this is going to help you become designers. So I want sort of a drum roll, please. And I want to say, how would we take a nomadic approach to design, to responding to the situation at hand? And this is what we've been waiting for a while now. Okay, oh look, I'm in a different place altogether. We have I'm now standing kind of in a park, and I'm a designer, and I want to take a nomadic approach to design. So what am I going to do? Well, let's say I have a design problem. My design problem is that I want to place benches in the park, and I want these benches to be very fit. I want them to, I mean, first I have to understand, well, what do I mean by having fit park benches? So that's a problem. I have to think about that for a minute. Okay, so what would you think makes a bench in a park fit? You could say, oh, well, it's really fit if it's beautiful. Okay, so is that a bench's goal? Is its goal to be beautiful? Maybe a little bit. That might be a portion of what's important to a bench. But if I'm thinking about like my role as a designer and placing benches in the park, I guess I could think about how I compose them in the park. So I could lay them out in a perfect circle and think, oh, that looks really pretty, very aesthetic, from my designer, master planner, global viewpoint of looking down in the plan. But is that really making benches fit? Okay, so I'm hoping that you're thinking that maybe fitness of the bench has something to do with, do people sit on the bench? And that maybe a metric for being able to measure fitness would have to do with, are people actually sitting on a bench or not? That could be kind of a fitness parameter that we judge, is a bench healthy or happy, or is it unhealthy and not happy? And for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to say that a bench is happy when lots of people come and sit on it, and that a bench is very sad when people don't come and sit on it. Now, I'm putting agency into the idea of a bench. I'm saying that the bench, I'm sort of personifying the bench and saying it can be happy or it can be very, very sad. And this is a useful kind of way for me to think about it because it moves agency away from people and puts it into the designed artifacts themselves. So we can think about those design artifacts as being the thing that is evolving to better meet people's needs. But I'm not going to worry about the people's needs right now. I just want to worry about it. I want to focus it from what is the bench's perspective. So in any of these exercises that we're going to be doing in the upcoming weeks, always try to go into the mindset of the material artifact rather than what people want. What does the artifact want? Okay, so let's keep going with this. So let's imagine, how might I figure out if a bench is going to be happy in a given location or not? So one way designers could do this is they could go and they could observe behavior in the park, see what people are doing in the park and where they're going. And that might provide some information. The other thing we could do is we could say, well, let's take a survey and see where people would like to have park benches. And then we hold a community consultation. And a few people from the community show up, and one guy's really, really vocal, and he says, I want my bench over here, and someone else says, I want a bench over there. And you get a sampling, but you're not sure exactly how accurate the sampling would be, but you could incorporate that information. You could do some sort of feasibility study and hope that your predictions are correct. So mostly the way architects work is we think about trying to make predictions, or we try to make compositions. We try to either create something that we think abstractly looks beautiful, or we try to say, oh, no, I'm more interested in what the users want, so I'm going to work with users and try to make predictions. And then based on those predictions, I create some fixed artifacts. So the question is there a way in which we could think about design where we can abandon those two approaches and actually treat the benches as agents in a complex system that are trying to adapt to the situation at hand? So, in order to do this, it's helpful if we expand what a bench can do a little bit. So let's imagine, first of all, that the benches, we somehow insert the idea that these are benches that are granted mobility. So they're autonomous benches and they can move within the park to different locations. Cool. So, we're not, this is a bit of a thought experiment, so don't worry too much about where the technology is. Don't say, oh, Sharon, that's never going to happen, because actually it's probably going to happen within the next few years. We have a lot of autonomy in materials now, and so the idea that a bench could potentially self-navigate isn't impossible. But then, if a bench can self-navigate, where is it navigating to? So how would a bench be exploring its fitness landscape, which in this case is a park landscape, to try to determine where it could be? So we talked already about the fact that fitness might be kind of measured according to people sitting on a bench makes the bench happy. So we could say, well, could we quantify that? So the amount of time a bench is occupied could be calibrated. Maybe the bench has a sensor and it monitors the idea of now I am being sat on, now I am not being sat on. So imagine that a bench is sat on 10 hours of the day, is almost constantly being sat on. That is a very happy bench. It's probably in a good location. Probably people are pretty content with it. Whereas another bench is a very unhappy bench. No one has sat on it. Someone bent over, put their foot on it to tie up their shoelace. That was it. Not a happy bench. So if we have a complex adaptive system, then we can say, could the benches then begin to self-organize in a way where they can become happier or fitter, of serving more of the public that is at the park? So the idea that we want to explore is that, say a bench that is very, very occupied is in one location, and another bench in another location has no occupancy. This one is actually acting as a bit of a signal, as a bit of a beacon that people are sitting here. So maybe the bench that isn't being sat on can begin to move closer to the bench where a lot of people are sitting. Now, we could think about this as, what is the carrying capacity going to be? If then at this point, this bench becomes really, really occupied, we know, okay, there's room in that niche for more people to be sitting. That's a popular spot. But if no one sits in that new bench, then we know, oh, well, this was actually the carrying capacity for this particular zone, because by adding a new bench, we didn't actually add any benefit to the system. That bench stayed empty. Well, now this bench that came close is free to go and explore at random a new location to try to find a location where its fitness goes up or the number of people sitting on it goes up. But it can still be guided by the behaviors of other benches in the park. Benches that are attracting a lot of people can kind of cue other benches to say, well, there may be a fitness attractor for you here, whereas benches that aren't receiving any people could operate under the assumption that this is perhaps not the fittest place to be. So this is imagining the benches as having sort of one degree of freedom, that they can just move. They can just go from location to location, hoping that they hit upon locations where benches are more utilized. And we can think about this like, imagine as swarm benches, right? They're sort of figuring out where they need to be based on sensors and this sort of ability to move. We could also then say, well, maybe it's not the location that was the problem in the first place. Maybe it was just that the bench is facing the wrong way. Like maybe there's a beautiful view if the bench had rotated one way, and a lousy view and it's just facing the wrong way. So we could build in another degree of freedom. We could sort of say, well, maybe we need to be able to not only have the benches move, but pivot, and that would actually offer us a better understanding of where fit locations would be. So we've added a degree of freedom. Think about the bed, where we were sort of thinking about what would a bed need to be fit. The third thing we could do is we could say, well, maybe it's not the location. Maybe it's the fact that there's too much sun. And so a bench on certain days needs shade, on other days it needs sun, and that is actually more what's controlling it. So benches are fit on really sunny days when they're located underneath trees. And it's not that the tree itself is what people want, it's the protection from the sun. So perhaps we could have benches that have canopies that come up. And so on sunny days, they raise a canopy, and on cloudy days, cloudy days, not too cloudy, you'd want the canopy up if it was raining. On rainy days, you would also want a shelter. On other days, you could bring that down. Then you could begin to sort of test by doing this walk along the fitness landscape. Remember, we were thinking about that when we were walking around that square. As a bench is moving, it could also be testing, well, what happens when I pivot? What happens when I raise an awning? And gradually, the benches will begin to respond to the situation at hand and decide for themselves where the best position would be in the park. So here we have a completely hands-off idea of what design could be, where, well, sorry, not completely. We move from designing the actual position of where benches could be, to designing a bench that has the potentiality to be activated in different ways, either in terms of its location, its orientation, and its disposition. covered or uncovered. So we've now given it 3 degrees of freedom, and it is free now to explore its own evolutionary potential. And you can compare, because you could have 3 benches in a row, and you could say, well, all of them are unoccupied. What happens if you raise the canopy on one of them? Is that now an occupied bench? If nothing changes, then that hasn't made that scenario more fit. But if that bench now is occupied, then it means that, well, let's raise the canopy on the second bench next to it and see if we still have people now gravitating to that location. So I hope this first example, and we're going to look at more of these, helps you to understand a way in which we could move towards design that is less about imposing static laws and regularities that we predetermine in advance, and more about an active exploration of this sort of space of potential, an exploration of this fitness landscape to understand what is the best disposition for design, and also how we could begin to think about design material artifacts as having more than one disposition, not having a single fixed essence, but rather kind of having a fluidity of ways in which that design artifact can interact with the environment around itself to form new kinds of assemblages, new kinds of opportunities where the material of the design artifact has agency. All right, thank you very much.